In December 1944, as the Pacific War reached its final and most desperate phase, a young Japanese intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda was deployed to a small tropical island called Lubang, west of the Philippines. He was 22 years old, disciplined, ambitious, and utterly devoted to the code of the Imperial Japanese Army. His orders were simple yet absolute: conduct guerrilla operations, resist the enemy, gather intelligence, and above all, never surrender. Under no circumstances was he to take his own life or give himself up to the Americans. He was to continue the mission until the Imperial Army returned. Lubang was covered in dense rainforest, cliffs, and mangroves. The island's population lived in small coastal villages, and the terrain made movement difficult. The Japanese garrison stationed there was small and disorganized, weakened by years of retreat and dwindling supplies. When Onoda arrived, he found chaos soldiers demoralized, command uncertain, and enemy pressure growing. He urged his men to fortify positions, hide ammunition, and prepare for a long war. When American forces landed in February 1945, the battle was swift and devastating. The Japanese defenders were overwhelmed. Many were killed, and the rest scattered into the jungle. The empire Onoda had sworn to serve was collapsing, though he did not yet know it. Along with a few remaining soldiers, he fled deep into the forest, determined to continue the mission he had been given. Weeks passed. Then, months. The sounds of war faded from the island, replaced by the endless rhythm of insects and tropical rain. Onoda and his comrades built crude shelters, hunted wild animals, and raided small farms for food. Occasionally, they found leaflets dropped from planes, announcing Japan's surrender. The leaflets contained official seals, photographs, and pleas from the emperor himself. But to Onoda, trained in counterintelligence, they were enemy fabrications, tools of psychological warfare. He had been instructed that such tactics would be used, and he refused to believe them. As 1945 came to an end, the world beyond Lubang entered a new era. Japan lay in ruins, and peace had returned to the Pacific. But on the island, a handful of men still moved through the forest, rifles in hand, convinced that the empire continued to fight. They believed the Americans occupied the towns only temporarily, that the Imperial Army would soon return to reclaim its lost territory. For Onoda, duty was eternal. He recorded his patrols in notebooks, maintained his uniform, and treated each sunrise as another day of war. The rain rotted their clothes, the jungle consumed their shelters, but their faith remained unbroken. He did not know that the war he fought had already become history. In his mind, surrender was impossible, and obedience was sacred. He had been given orders, and those orders had no end. By early 1946, the world had entered a fragile peace. But on the Philippine island of Lubang, the war continued in the shadows. Hiroo Onoda and a small group of surviving soldiers still patrolled the dense jungle. Believing the enemy remained active, they moved at night, set ambushes, and avoided open ground. Their uniforms were torn and faded, their equipment rusted by tropical rain, but their sense of duty remained untouched. For them, the empire still existed, and Japan would one day call them home. The group followed a strict military routine. Onoda maintained a chain of command, assigning watches, organizing rations, and writing coded notes that would never reach their intended recipients. Every rustle in the forest, every light from a village, was interpreted as enemy movement. When planes flew overhead, he assumed they were American bombers. The isolation only reinforced his belief that the battle for the Pacific had never truly ended. In the nearby villages, stories began to circulate about ghosts in the forest, men in old uniforms who stole rice and livestock under the cover of darkness. Farmers would sometimes hear distant shots or find their animals missing. The Philippine authorities believed small bands of bandits were responsible, but Onoda knew otherwise. In his mind, these acts were legitimate wartime operations, tactical missions carried out against enemy collaborators. Occasionally, aircraft dropped more leaflets, announcing the end of the war and urging Japanese soldiers to surrender. Some even included names of officers and details about the emperor's speech of surrender. But Onoda examined them with suspicion. He compared the writing styles, the paper quality, the format of military seals, and concluded they were counterfeits. The enemy, he reasoned, would say anything to draw them out of hiding. His training had prepared him for deception, and so he chose to disbelieve the truth. Years passed, and the group dwindled. Illness, exhaustion, and clashes with local police claimed the lives of his comrades. By the early 1952, only 3 men remained: Onoda, Corporal Shimada, and Private Kozuka. They had become a small army of ghosts, moving through the forest with the discipline of soldiers who could not accept peace. Onoda continued to lead, insisting that orders were orders. Their mission, as he saw it, was not only to survive, but to maintain honor in a world that no longer existed. The jungle became their universe. Rainwater was their drinking supply. Wild bananas, coconuts, and small animals sustained them. Their weapons, meticulously maintained, symbolized the empire they still served. They sewed their torn uniforms with vines and bark, believing that appearance reflected discipline. Onoda wrote in his logbooks about enemy patrols that never existed, about victories that were imagined, and about a future that would never arrive. The islanders grew used to the strange presence in the hills. Sometimes the soldiers would descend at night, leaving footprints near farms or taking food. They were seen as phantoms from another age, men trapped in a war that had already ended. But for Onoda, surrender was not an option. To give up was to betray everything he had been taught to believe. He did not know that, far away, Japan had rebuilt itself and entered a new world. For him, history had frozen in the year 1945, and every passing day was just another day of duty. By the early 1952, Hiroo Onoda had been living in the jungle for nearly a decade. The world had changed beyond recognition. Yet on the island of Lubang, time remained still. He and his remaining comrades continued to believe that Japan was still fighting somewhere beyond the sea. Their orders, carved into their minds, were clear: hold the island, resist the enemy, and never surrender. The group had shrunk to 3 men. They built new shelters in deeper parts of the forest, choosing high ground for visibility and safety. They dug concealed storage pits for ammunition and kept a careful inventory of their supplies. Their rifles, now more than 10 years old, were still functional, cleaned daily with palm oil and cloth. The jungle had become their barracks, every path, tree, and stream memorized like the lines of a map. They continued to live by military discipline. Onoda, as the ranking officer, kept the structure intact. He assigned patrols, organized lookout posts, and even conducted training exercises. They recorded imaginary enemy movements in notebooks, convinced that the Americans and their allies still occupied the villages below. Each sign of civilization, a car engine, a church bell, a child's voice, was filtered through the lens of wartime suspicion. To the villagers of Lubang, they were now legends. Farmers whispered about Japanese ghosts who appeared in the night to steal rice or sugar. Occasionally, a body was found in the fields, a villager mistaken for a spy. Onoda viewed such incidents not as crimes, but as necessary wartime measures. Every act of survival was, to him, part of a sacred mission. The Japanese government, learning that small groups of soldiers might still be alive, began organized search operations. They sent delegations, broadcasted messages over loudspeakers, and dropped new leaflets bearing personal letters from families. Onoda's own relatives pleaded for him to come home. He analyzed every word and concluded that the letters were forgeries, written by the Americans to weaken morale. The handwriting seemed too uniform, the phrasing too deliberate. To him, it was all a trick. The years blurred into one another. When typhoons hit the island, Onoda's camp was destroyed, and they rebuilt it each time with the same persistence. Hunger became a constant enemy. They trapped wild pigs, collected rainwater, and dried meat under makeshift roofs. When diseases spread, they treated wounds with herbs and cloth. Every hardship was seen as part of their duty. In 1954, one of Onoda's companions, Corporal Shimada, was shot and killed during a skirmish with local police. His death left only two Onoda and Private Kozuka. They buried Shimada under the jungle canopy, marking the grave with stones and branches. Onoda saluted in silence, believing his comrade had died honorably in the service of the emperor. By then, Onoda had spent almost 10 years in a world that no longer existed. Japan was peaceful, prosperous, and modernizing rapidly. But on Lubang, he remained frozen in time, a soldier without an army, carrying out a war that had ended long ago. The jungle had swallowed his life, but his sense of purpose remained unbroken. To surrender was still unthinkable. For him, the war could only end when Japan itself returned for him, in person, to lift the burden of his final order. By the late 1952, Hiroo Onoda had been living in the jungle for more than a decade. The tropical forest had become both his prison and his home. The once young intelligence officer was now in his mid-30s, hardened by years of isolation, shaped by the same routine that had once defined his life as a soldier. For him, time had no meaning. The war remained a constant presence, invisible, eternal, and unquestioned. Only one man remained by his side, Private Kozuka. The two men had become brothers in endurance. They rarely spoke, communicating through gestures, habits, and shared understanding. Together they continued to live by the imperial code. Each morning began with a quiet inspection of weapons, followed by reconnaissance around their territory. They took notes on local activity, believing that the villagers worked for the Americans. When gunfire or explosions were heard in the distance, often from farmers clearing fields, they interpreted them as signs that the enemy still occupied the island. The forest itself was both protector and tormentor. Its green canopy shielded them from detection, but also trapped them in endless dampness and heat. The insects never stopped, and every movement stirred clouds of mosquitoes. During the monsoon season, the rain turned the ground into mud, destroying shelters and soaking everything they owned. Yet even then, Onoda never abandoned discipline. Each hardship, he believed, was proof of loyalty. Occasionally, planes flew overhead civilian flights that connected Manila with nearby islands. Onoda and Kozuka would hide beneath thick leaves, certain they were enemy reconnaissance missions. Sometimes, voices from portable radios reached them faintly through the jungle, fragments of songs, advertisements, or news broadcasts. To Onoda, they were enemy transmissions. He refused to believe that Japan could produce such peaceful sounds while the war still raged. In 1959, rumors of surviving Japanese soldiers on Lubang reached Tokyo again. Another search team arrived, carrying photographs, loudspeakers, and letters from families. Leaflets were dropped, telling the story of Japan's post-war recovery, the rebuilding of cities, the return of peace. To most of the world, it was an act of compassion. To Onoda, it was deception perfected. The idea that Japan could have surrendered, rebuilt, and moved on was unthinkable. He burned the leaflets and moved deeper into the hills. Years passed without change. Onoda began to lose track of seasons. He marked time only by the moon and the growth of plants. His uniform had become a patchwork of old fabric and natural fibers. He kept his rifle clean and oiled, wrapping it carefully each night. It was the last link to the empire he served. He believed that one day, perhaps decades from now, a landing force would return, and he would rejoin his command. Until then, he would wait. The villagers had long learned to live with his presence. They avoided certain areas, leaving small offerings of food to prevent raids. Children grew up hearing stories of the phantom soldier in the hills, a man who lived among ghosts. To them, he was no longer an enemy, but a mystery, a remnant of another age. By the early 1962, Onoda had survived 17 years in the jungle. His body had adapted, his senses sharpened, his mind disciplined beyond breaking. Yet beneath that discipline, a quiet emptiness began to grow, the weight of years spent fighting a war no one else remembered. Still, he stood by his orders. The Empire, he believed, would call him back. Until that moment, he would remain where duty had placed him, bound to the silence of the forest that had become his entire world. By the mid-1960s, Hiroo Onoda had become a ghost of history. The world outside had changed beyond imagination. Cities rebuilt, technology advancing, generations growing up without memory of war. But deep within the forest of Lubang, one man continued to live by the rules of an empire that no longer existed. For nearly 20 years, he had woken with the same thought: the mission is not over. Private Kozuka remained his only companion. Together, they maintained a sense of purpose through routine. They repaired their weapons, patrolled the hills, and observed the island's villages through binoculars scavenged from wreckage. The jungle was both ally and adversary, providing food but denying comfort. They lived by instinct, moving camps frequently to avoid detection. Each new clearing became headquarters. Each night's silence, a battlefield waiting to reawaken. Occasionally, they saw ships pass beyond the coastline, lights flickering on the horizon. Onoda believed they were American patrols. He convinced himself that Japan had withdrawn strategically to prepare for a renewed offensive. He saw his mission as a small but essential part of that grand strategy to hold territory, report activity, and await the signal for Japan's return. The human mind, when isolated long enough, clings to purpose as the last defense against despair. Throughout the 1960 seconds, local police and farmers reported occasional encounters. Rice storages were raided, and crops stolen. A few gunshots echoed through the night. Authorities organized searches, but the soldiers always vanished into the jungle before dawn. Each new report added to the legend of the Japanese holdouts, men who had forgotten the passage of time. In Japan, these stories became newspaper curiosities, tales of soldiers lost in history. Expeditions were launched to search for them, but years of failure turned the efforts into myth. For the Japanese public, Onoda was an unnamed symbol of blind loyalty. For the villagers of Lubang, he was a living shadow of war. In 1969, Kozuka and Onoda attempted one of their rare coordinated raids, burning piles of harvested rice that they believed were supplies for the enemy. Local police responded, and in the confusion, Kozuka was fatally shot. His death ended 25 years of shared survival. Onoda buried him in the forest with a soldier's care, saluting the grave, whispering a report to a command that would never hear it. From that moment, he was completely alone. For the next several years, Onoda's existence became quieter, more spectral. He avoided all human contact, setting traps for food and collecting rainwater for survival. His rifle, still functional, remained the center of his identity, the tool that defined him as a soldier of Japan. Each night, he wrote mental notes for reports that had no recipient, maintaining the illusion of a duty still in progress. When storms swept across the island, he rebuilt his camp from what nature left behind. When illness struck, he treated himself with plants and rest. When loneliness grew unbearable, he focused on repetition, inspecting his weapon, memorizing terrain, listening to the sounds of the forest. The jungle, once vast and hostile, had become his entire reality. By the early 1970s, nearly 30 years had passed since the war's end. The world had reached the age of satellites and color television, but Onoda still lived as if it were 1945. To him, every sunrise meant another day of service to a nation that had forgotten him. He was the last man on an island of memories, the soldier whom time itself had refused to claim. In February 1974, nearly 3 decades after World War II had ended, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki arrived on the island of Lubang. He was an adventurer and a student of history who had heard stories of a lone Japanese soldier still hiding in the jungle. The Philippine authorities had long considered the tales to be local folklore, but Suzuki believed otherwise. He declared that he wanted to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. Abominable, armed with little more than a camera, a pack of supplies, and determination, Suzuki entered the jungle. The local villagers warned him of the ghost soldier, who would shoot at intruders, but he pressed on. Days passed as he followed faint trails, abandoned camps, and markings on trees. Then, one morning, a figure emerged from the dense green, a man in a tattered uniform, carrying a rifle polished by time. His posture was upright, his expression calm but wary. The man spoke little, cautious and reserved. His weapon remained loaded. Suzuki realized immediately that he had found him, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, still living by orders from an empire that had long ceased to exist. Onoda did not believe that the war had ended. Suzuki showed him newspapers and photographs, but Onoda remained skeptical. To him, this could be another deception by the enemy. He told Suzuki that he would not surrender until his commanding officer gave him direct orders to do so. Suzuki returned to Japan with proof of the encounter photographs and Onoda's story. The world was stunned. In Tokyo, headlines declared that a man who had continued fighting World War II was still alive in the Philippines. The Japanese government immediately began efforts to contact his former superior officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had long retired and was now a bookseller in rural Japan. When he learned that his former subordinate had remained faithful to orders for 30 years, he agreed to travel to Lubang personally. In March 1974, Major Taniguchi arrived on the island. The Philippine government provided an escort. The meeting took place deep in the forest, near Onoda's camp. The old officer stood in civilian clothes, reading a formal statement written decades earlier. The words were clear and direct. The war is over. You are relieved of your duties. Onoda listened in silence, his rifle at his side. For the first time in 30 years, his orders had changed. Slowly, he removed the bullets from his weapon and placed them on the ground. His posture relaxed slightly, though his face remained expressionless. He saluted his former commander, accepting the truth that had taken half a lifetime to reach him. The next day, Onoda walked out of the jungle in full uniform. His rifle was operational, his sword polished, and his imperial insignia still visible. Crowds gathered to watch as he stepped into the modern world. The Philippine government, acknowledging his circumstances, granted him a pardon for the attacks committed during his long years in hiding. Reporters surrounded him, cameras flashing. He stood calmly, a figure from another century walking into the age of jet engines and television. After 30 years of isolation, Hiroo Onoda's war had finally ended. Yet, even as he returned to civilization, his eyes held the same quiet intensity, the look of a man who had never truly. When Hiroo Onoda stepped off the airplane in Tokyo in March 1974, the world that greeted him bore no resemblance to the one he had left behind. The skyline glittered with neon lights, streets were filled with cars and noise, and television cameras followed his every movement. For Japan, he was a living relic, a soldier from a vanished empire, returned from a war that had ended before most of the onlookers were even born. He was dressed in his original uniform, carefully repaired and immaculately clean. His rifle, sword, and dagger had been carried out of the jungle with him, still in working condition. The discipline that had sustained him for 30 years was visible in every gesture, controlled, deliberate, unbroken. Reporters flooded him with questions, but he answered few. His voice was quiet, his expression unreadable. To him, the world seemed both familiar and entirely foreign. In Japan, his arrival became a national event. Some praised his loyalty and endurance, calling him a symbol of unwavering duty. Others viewed him as a tragic figure, a man who had wasted half his life fighting a war that had long ended. Crowds lined the streets to see him, waving flags and calling his name. For the first time, Onoda realized how completely the nation he had imagined serving no longer existed. The Japan of his memory, the empire of honor and obedience, had been replaced by a modern democracy focused on peace and progress. He met with government officials and military representatives. They expressed admiration, but also discomfort. His story was both inspiring and unsettling, a reminder of how deeply devotion could bind a person to an illusion. The emperor he had once served from afar was still alive, but the system that had defined Onoda's entire existence was gone. No army awaited his reports, no command structure demanded his obedience. For the first time, he had no orders to follow. The adjustment was painful. He struggled with the noise of cities, the abundance of food, and the constant presence of people. Technology fascinated and confused him. Cars that started without cranks, lights that turned on with a switch, television showing images of a peaceful world. At night, he often woke abruptly, expecting the sound of gunfire or the rustle of an enemy patrol. The instincts of survival were too deeply ingrained to fade quickly. Public attention followed him everywhere. He was invited to appear on television, to write a book, to speak about his experiences. Yet fame felt hollow. For 30 years, his life had been guided by simplicity. One mission, one belief, one purpose. Now, he was surrounded by complexity, by a society that had long stopped believing in such absolute duty. He moved carefully through this new world, polite but distant, his thoughts still half in the jungle he had left behind. Despite the admiration, he felt isolated. The discipline that had kept him alive also separated him from others. He missed the silence of the forest, the rhythm of survival, the clarity of mission. Civilization, with all its comfort, felt chaotic and insincere. Onoda began to realize that returning to peace could be harder than living through war. He spoke occasionally to journalists about what had kept him alive: loyalty, self-control, and faith in orders. "A soldier must obey," he said, not as justification, but as simple truth. Yet behind his calm words lay something deeper: the understanding that obedience had cost him 30 years of life. In the public's eyes, he was a hero. In his own, he was a man who had simply done his duty and found that the world had left him behind.